Hello, everybody. My name's Alistair Roth. I'm the Executive Director of AIIA in Victoria. Welcome to our webinar, and thank you all for your interest and for logging in. We've got, I don't know, nearly 300 people registered. I think when we started planning this a few weeks ago, we had no idea quite how topical it was going to be. But before I introduce the session proper, just a few words on the running order. After the talk, we'll take questions and get through as many as we can in the time available. Many of you now very familiar with Zoom, but of course, you can type your question in the Q&A tab in the toolbar at the bottom of your screen, and you can vote on questions posed by the people, and we'll send out a recording of the talk afterwards. So to today's webinar, and to tell us what it's like as a foreign correspondent in Trump's America, we're joined by Zoe Daniel. Now, of course, anyone who watches ABC News, Zoe needs no introduction, but she's recently back from 4 years as the ABC's US Bureau Chief based in Washington. Before that, she had about 4 years as Southeast Asia correspondent in Bangkok, after which she kindly donated for our wonderful library here a copy of her book, Storyteller. And if you like what you hear today, you can track it down and read more. She's also been Africa correspondent as well. So Zoe, a fascinating career so far as foreign correspondent. Thank you so much for joining us today, and we look forward to hearing from you and see you for the Q&A.
Thank you, Alistair, and thank you everyone for joining us. It's great to have such interest, although I'm not surprised considering everything that's going on in the US right now. I'll make some preliminary remarks just to introduce myself and give you some context around my time in the US, but I haven't prepared anything particularly formal because I presumed, given the fast-moving situation that we've seen over the last week or so, and also against the backdrop of COVID-19, that a Q&A might be a more productive way of getting to the things that you want to know. But just to explain my history as Bureau Chief in the United States, I was appointed to that role in mid to late 2015. My family and I arrived in Washington, DC in December of that year. So I was lucky enough to cover that eye-opening presidential campaign, where, of course, when I was appointed to that role in July 2015, the clear expectation was that Hillary Clinton would become president of the United States. Donald Trump was just emerging as a kind of novelty reality TV candidate, and at that point, very few people were taking him seriously. The timing of my arrival, I think, was quite pivotal to my understanding of what was going on, because arriving just before Christmas of 2015, in the new year, I launched straight into covering the primaries and caucuses for the 2016 election. So very early in that year, I found myself in Iowa, in New Hampshire, and then progressively traveling all around the country, talking to people to vote for. And it became apparent to me very quickly that Donald Trump was a lot more popular than perhaps the prevailing wisdom assumed that he was, both in the United States, but particularly internationally, where he wasn't being taken seriously at all. It became apparent almost instantly to me that he did have a deep base of support, and that base of support was perhaps more loyal than Hillary Clinton's. To put that in context, the events that Donald Trump was running during that campaign, which have been similar to the ones that he's run intermittently throughout his presidency, were those large-scale campaign rallies where thousands of people would be turning up to see him speak. Many times we arrived at basketball stadiums and there were thousands of people who had queued perhaps through the night or from the dawn to see him speak the following evening. Hillary Clinton's events, by contrast, were perhaps a couple of hundred people in a much more intimate setting at a high school basketball court or something like that. So it became very clear quite quickly that Donald Trump had a lot of support, and I guess the question around that immediately was, well, why? Why is this man inspiring people? And I think there are a few layers to that. One is that he was very much the anti-politician, and in that sense, he was the perfect candidate, if you like, to run against Hillary Clinton from a Republican perspective, because she is very much your classic elitist politician, according to those who sit against that type of politics. Many people deeply dislike Hillary Clinton because of her time as Secretary of State and as a senator, and she really was incapable of shaking that. She's also not a particularly dynamic speaker, so there was some pretty deep contrast when it came to TV coverage of Hillary campaigning versus Donald Trump, who was running those huge rock star style events. During the 2016 campaign, I really developed quite a strong view that, if not likely, it was at least very possible that he would win the election. And this sat in stark contrast to the polling that was going on at the time, which very late in 2016 still indicated fairly solidly that Hillary Clinton would win. A few weird things happened in the latter part of that campaign, as you'd be aware, but even going into the election itself, it still appeared that Hillary Clinton would win the election. I used to go back to my office in DC after I'd been out on the road, and I was very blessed to spend time all over the US, not only in that year, but in the 4 years of the posting. I think I went to 44 states. And so I spent a lot of time just talking to average people about their voting intentions, their life concerns, their priorities, and the things that come up on repeat are lack of available healthcare and the fact that someone getting sick in your family can effectively crash your entire life, because you may well have to sell everything to try to get them decent healthcare. And the other thing that really is important to most Americans, particularly in those so-called flyover states or working class areas, is simple jobs, money in their pockets, and opportunities for their kids. And these are the sorts of things that were, it seems to me, driving people towards Donald Trump, in the sense that in railing against what they perceived as the elitism of politicians, and the Clintons being sort of the definition of that for a lot of people, Donald Trump was seen as this fresh, straight-talking, pragmatist and populist who was addressing their concerns directly. And although many people would admit that there were things about him at that time that they didn't like, and I'll speak to Donald Trump now a little later, but back in 2016, things around his language towards women, his racist language around not only African Americans but immigration, particularly dog whistling on that, use of Twitter, inflammatory language on foreign policy issues, all those sorts of things. A lot of people would, when you question them about that, would say, yeah, I don't really like that, but I like the other things about him enough that I'm prepared to ignore those things, or sort of put them in a box. They're a smaller issue for me than the other things that I think that he can bring to America. After the 2016 election, and I was at the Hillary Clinton event on that night, and I had said to my immediate boss in Sydney that I was concerned about the way that we were resourcing election night, from the perspective that I wanted to make sure that we had enough resources at the Clinton headquarters and the Trump headquarters, because I, even at that point, was not convinced at all that she was going to win the election. So we made sure that we spread the staff so that we had enough capacity to deal with that. And if you're on this call, I guess you're interested enough that you would have been closely monitoring what happened on that night. I found myself effectively covering a wake with people in tears, people just lying on the floor in that glass-roofed building in New York, stunned that Donald Trump had won the election while this huge party was going on across town. And one thing that has always stuck in my mind from that night was that someone said to me, one of Hillary Clinton's supporters said to me, I feel like our country's been taken over by aliens. I don't know who these people are. And I said, well, have you ever been to Ohio or Iowa or Kentucky or any of the places that are different to New York? And he said, well, no, if I travel, I go to California or maybe I go to Florida or I go overseas. And it struck me as part of the thing that's sort of driving a deep disconnect in the US, in that unless you work in particular fields, it's a big enough, highly populated enough place that you can exist within your comfort zone, and you don't necessarily have to challenge yourself on the views that you're exposed to, and that applies to Democrats and Republicans. And I think that that's very deeply fed by an incredibly partisan media environment. Again, a big enough country that it can support very far right, very far left media outlets. And I think that there are a few that are sitting in the middle. NPR or PBS would be sort of the closest to that I can think of, but they are still left-leaning. But it's very easy to just consume what you want to hear there. And unfortunately, that doesn't lead to any sort of deeper understanding of your fellow human and what their perspective on things might be. So what you ended up with after the 2016 election, in my mind, was two really angry groups of people. Angry Democrats or people on the left who felt that Donald Trump wasn't an appropriate person to be leading their country for various ways, who felt that those who had voted for him were ill-informed, and angry people on the other side of politics who felt really let down by that attitude and took great offence at the perspective of the so-called progressives that their vote wasn't worth as much as the progressive vote was. That the fact that they had voted in Donald Trump in a democratic process wasn't seen as valid enough to be respected. And that has sort of fed a sense of his position being undermined throughout the period that he's been in office. I wanted to mention Inauguration Day 2017 just briefly, in part just because of looking at what's been happening on our TV screens over the last week. And it particularly resonated with me today or overnight when I've been watching the goings on in Washington, DC, which was my home for 4 years. That some of the scenes were quite similar to what we saw on Inauguration Day. Certainly what we're seeing now is on a larger scale, but there were what they'd call Antifa on the streets. So the sort of description would be the violent left. You had white supremacists, so-called, running around, and every group in between fomenting division and unrest on that day. And it's a very uncertain environment to work in as a journalist. I was reminded of the fact that I was standing on a street corner and I noticed that Richard Spencer of the alt-right was in the vicinity, and I walked up to him to ask what he was doing there, because at that time there was a limousine being burnt, there were buildings being smashed, there were tyres being burnt in the street, there were a lot of masked people running around who were anti-Trump, so you would assume they were therefore on the left, and it seems to me that he was antagonising them perhaps by being there. I went up to ask him what he was doing there, and while I was interviewing him, he was attacked by one of these masked men and punched in the head in a video that I think has now been viewed tens of millions of times. But it really did remind me of the sorts of scenes that we're seeing on the street in DC today and across America. And I'm sure you'll have some questions on that. I think the other thing that I wanted to mention was that the entire posting that I had as bureau chief over the 4 years was pretty relentless and busy and unpredictable in a lot of ways. But that year, 2017, which was Donald Trump's first year in office, was by far the most busy and relentless, and also fascinating, as he set about achieving the promises that he had made before the 2016 election. And I think this is something to note with Donald Trump, that I think internationally a lot of people sort of view him through the prism of the chaos theory that he tends to employ in the way that he runs the country. Whereas in the background, he's actually doing quite a few things that tend to slip through without getting a lot of attention. For example, well, one notable thing which did get a lot of attention was putting new justices onto the Supreme Court, which therefore influences American policy for a generation. But beyond that, putting a lot of Republican-oriented justices onto the lower courts as well. So sort of backstacking what he's doing in that regard. Other promises that he made that he's kept, like them or not, pulling out of the Iran nuclear deal, pulling out of the Paris Agreement, tax reform, moving the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, all sorts of shaking up NATO, removing regulation on companies so that they can do things without as many environmental restrictions. Some of these things are incredibly frustrating to many people, but they still tick boxes around what Donald Trump aimed to achieve when he came to office and what he told those supporters that he would do. So much as when you view it from overseas, you sort of just view it through this who's getting sacked, what's he saying on Twitter sort of behaviour. Those people who voted for him, well, those that I've gone back to, and I've gone back to several, are quite happy with how he's performed, particularly in the context that at least until coronavirus happened, much as there were some predictions about how things might look towards the end of this year in regard to the economy tapering off. But things had been looking very good in regard to jobs and the economy generally. And as I said at the beginning of my remarks, many Americans, particularly in those sort of industrial states that have seen huge change over time, in fairly recent history due to things like automation. And much as they blame politicians for what's happened to them, a lot of it has just been to do with modernisation of society. But still, they want things to go back to how they were in terms of the opportunities that they have, but more specifically, the opportunities that their children have. And that's what they hoped that Donald Trump would bring to them. I think the big question that we have now is how the twin effect of the coronavirus and the civil unrest that we're now seeing in the United States affects the views of those people who did vote for Donald Trump, whether some of them will turn against him. I tend to think many of them will not. But I think the other perhaps bigger question is how many people will turn out to vote against Donald Trump who didn't turn out to vote in 2016, because of course in a country without compulsory voting that's very key. So enough there, hopefully, to inspire some questions, and I'm conscious of leaving enough time for those. So Alistair, if you'd like to throw me some.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Zoe. We'll probably jump around a bit from your experience there as a journalist to geopolitical, but let's kick off, ties a little bit in with what's going on today. There appears to be evidence of the US police disregarding the safety of the press, assaulting them. Or did you notice a change in the relationship with the police during your time there? And do you think reports about their potential excesses has had any impact on that?
Look, I have been roughed up by the US police several times. I was actually picked up by the shoulders by a police officer and thrown at a protest in DC. It absolutely shocked the living daylights out of me. It wasn't designed to hurt me, but it was designed to remove me from the path. My experience of the police in the US is that if they're clearing a space, and if that space, particularly if it's anywhere in the vicinity of the White House, they have very little tolerance for whoever is there, and they're not going to stop and check if you're a journalist or not. That said, what's happened in the last few days does appear to be an escalation, in that there has been obvious, if not violence, but some pretty tough acts from police towards journalists who are very obviously journalists, who are holding microphones, who are carrying cameras, and therefore should be allowed to document what's going on without fearing the police, because covering civil unrest is incredibly difficult anyway, because you don't quite know who the enemy is or where the projectiles might be coming from or whatever. So having to protect yourself from the police is another thing altogether. I mean, I think that the one concern that's been raised, and I'm sure, America's a big country with very diverse views. I'm sure some police have been influenced by Donald Trump's anti-press, fake news, enemy of the people rhetoric over time, just as some of his supporters have been. I mean, I've been penned in at Donald Trump's rallies, getting spat on by people who are attending and yelled at and screamed at, and I've witnessed that happening to other journalists as well. So there are a portion of people through the community, and I'm sure there's a portion of police too, who have been influenced by that.
A follow-on question, turning to the White House press conferences themselves. Did you see a difference in the treatment of the press from, I suppose, at the time you went there at the end of the Obama administration to during the Trump administration?
Yeah, well, I mean, if you're starting a press conference or a White House briefing with not really wanting to tell people what's going on, then it's going to be instantly combative. And even during the Obama administration, there was some combative times in the White House briefing room, but it very much became a fight between the press and the press secretary and the president, virtually from day one. I mean, you'll recall that Sean Spicer claimed that a particular number of people were at the inauguration, and that photographic evidence showed that that was complete rubbish. So that pretty much kicked off a negative relationship between the press, the president, and the press secretary straight away. I was at the press conference where Jim Acosta and Donald Trump almost came to blows. Jim Acosta from CNN, and then Jim was banned from the White House for a short period. So there was a lot of antagonism, but I think that was born by the fact that over time, particularly the press became very frustrated with not being able to get answers out of the White House, not being able to get a straight answer on anything. Not only from the press secretary, but from any of the sort of backroom staff. Getting an answer out of anyone on anything was impossible either because things were in disarray, the staff was turning over so quickly and frequently, or simply that their whole modus operandi was to keep a tight lid on everything that they were doing. They didn't necessarily feel that they had to share that.
So more widely, given the growing partisanship and declining US trust in the media, what can be done to repair the relationship between the people and the free press?
Look, it's incredibly difficult. I mean, I think that probably the press does need to take some steps towards trying to repair that relationship. But the thing is that it's going to take someone to step forward. And I mean the relationship with the public more than with the White House, because, you know, eventually that will change. But the problem is that the level of trust in the press there is so low that people, they'll either watch Fox News and think it's all rubbish, or watch CNN and think it's all rubbish, or read the New York Times and think it's all rubbish, because that goes against the principles that they have. But as I said, you know, people consume what they want to hear there. And what's different is that whereas here, if you turn on various programs or pick up various publications, you will get exposed to various points of view, but there it's possible just not to.
Just sweeping across to the other side of politics, Joe Biden said he'll select a female running mate. Have you got any prognosis of how the election might play out in November anyway? And do you think Biden's got anyone in mind for that role?
Look, I think before coronavirus, I was almost 100% sure that Donald Trump would win the election. And I didn't think Biden had a chance of beating him, in part just because I felt that Biden's time had probably passed, that he might have had a chance of beating Donald Trump in 2016. He just doesn't generate as much conversation, and Donald Trump tends to just control the narrative so well that it's been incredibly difficult for the Democrats to actually get any traction. So there's that. Now that coronavirus has been introduced, it seemed to me that it was going to be impossible to predict who would actually win, because the variables of what might happen between now and November are so difficult to predict. But then now that you introduce racially charged riots, I feel that the pendulum swings back to Trump, because he's very good at capitalizing on division. And again, he'll control the narrative to try to use that effectively. And you saw him today announcing himself as the law and order president. And to me, that's okay. That's the brand for the election. And I talked about the way that he likes to tick boxes on promises. So if that's a promise, then he'll be going all out to try to implement that. In terms of female running mates, Kamala Harris has always sort of struck me as the most obvious person. She's young and dynamic. She's after Hillary's failure, they were probably never going to put her in as a presidential candidate because she's a bit too feisty, which is an unfortunate thing for women, that we often pay for being a little bit too outspoken. But as a VP, that might work. I sort of feel like Elizabeth Warren would be too far left, although Kamala is as well. But she seems to me to be the most obvious option.
There was a headline in the Weekend Australian describing the US as the land of the fearful and the home of the hateful and heavily armed. How accurate do you think that reflects the US now and in the near future?
I don't know. I had a friend saying to me yesterday that she feels that everyone in the US is fearful. Everyone, when they go out of their house, is fearful, worrying that something's going to happen to them. And I mean, I lived there for 4 years. I didn't walk around feeling worried, and I don't think that generally people do. I mean, I had some concerns about sending my children to school there because of gun violence. So if there was something that I was fearful about, it was that. But generally, life there for a lot of people is very similar to what it is in Australia. But I think what you do have is deep wealth disparity. And not to say that we don't have poverty and racial division here, we do. But with such a large number of desperately poor people and a large African-American population and a large Latino population and a very large amount of wealth concentrated among very few people, and then other people, a lot of other people struggling, then that breeds dissent and a sense of why is there not more equality here? And particularly when you talk about what I mentioned before about things like access to healthcare, just the most basic things, access to good education for your children, college fees make going to university out of the reach of many people. So there are lots of blocks there that in Australia we don't have. And I think, the whole police killing black men and the trigger for the riots that we're seeing now, that's very deeply ingrained because it has happened so many times, and people in that sense, African Americans do and are fearful in the sense that if they are pulled over in their car, they have a very high chance of being shot. So they will teach their children to keep their hands visible and all those sorts of things out of a very real and legitimate concern. So that is something that is hard to live with.
How were you, as an Aussie journalist there, accepted by the average person in the street? Do they know much about Australia? Do they wonder why you're there? How did that go?
They love Australians there. Or Americans love Australians in general, which is really nice. And I do think that it makes it easier to cover something like the Trump presidency, because you're not seen, even though you're press, you're not seen as being aligned with either the left or right press or a particular organisation which people have, their particular view about how that organisation frames things. And also what we do at the ABC is, we endeavour as much as we can to give, a good broad perspective about what's happening and to just tell an honest story. So, I think overwhelmingly positive. One thing that I would say is that getting access to politicians there is quite difficult. Getting access to sort of big players is quite difficult. They tend to love Australians, but at the end of the day, we're small fish in a big pond of millions of media over there, so it can be difficult to be able to ask directly those in power, and that was a contrast for me compared to my time in Southeast Asia, for example, where we had great access to the leaders of those countries and that kind of thing.
Which actually leads on to another question. How many representatives does the ABC have in the US, and are they all Washington based and travel out?
Yeah, so we only have 3 correspondents, and they're all based in Washington. We also have 3 producers and 2 camera operators and an administrative staff member. So it's a bureau of 8. The bureau covers not only the US, but also Canada and Central and South America. So, I went to Mexico several times, Venezuela, Canada, there's, Brazil. It's a huge beat to cover. And I have to be honest and say, during the first, especially the first year of Trump, we had several people come over and give us a hand, but we probably could have doubled the staff in the Bureau to deal with all of the news that Donald Trump was generating during that time.
Yeah, and do you think Americans in turn are aware of how the Trump administration is viewed in the rest of the world? Well, their international coverage is not that widespread, I don't think.
Well, I think increasingly Americans who do have a slightly more of a worldview are concerned that America is slipping in terms of how it's viewed internationally. I think, you know, there is a cohort of Americans that's quite embarrassed about what they would see as haphazard decision-making, as a loss of American exceptionalism and a rolling back of America as a global leader in the last few years. But again, there is another portion of the community that is well behind the America First Trump administration approach.
You'd mentioned Mexico, and I was about to ask that because the question is Mexico and Mexicans featured heavily in Trump's campaign. I was going to ask, had you been there and covered it, but what's your view of the Mexico-US bilateral relationship?
Well, I mean, I think it's a difficult one for Donald Trump because he prosecutes the dog whistling on immigration because that goes to people in the sorts of inland communities that I was talking about who've lost their jobs over time and in part blame that on those jobs going to countries where it's cheaper to do manufacturing and things like that. But that said, you know, America is also reliant on trade with Mexico and also human labour from Mexico. I mean, there's a huge number of Mexicans who work in the US. Not only Mexicans, I mean, many people from throughout South and Central America make up a huge portion of the community. So it's a complex issue for him to navigate. The Latino people that I've spoken to, and there are many, I think they're just very sad about the fact that they've sort of been vilified in the way that they have, because of course most of those people are just incredibly hardworking people who've moved to the US, contributed to society, brought up families there, started businesses and all those sorts of things. And then, you know, they get sort of tarred with Donald Trump's rhetoric around rapists coming from Mexico and those sorts of things. And then that then perhaps spins off on them in the way that they're treated when they're walking down the street and all those sorts of things. So, you know, I think it's complicated and difficult.
We've obviously got a couple of journalism students, I guess, or budding journalists dialed in. So there are a couple of questions. One, well, how did you start your career? And a second follow-on is, what preparation does the ABC give to foreign correspondents before they deploy overseas?
Yep, so I did a journalism degree in Adelaide. I was born in Melbourne, grew up in Tasmania, but went to Adelaide when I was 18 to do a journalism degree at the University of South Australia. When I was in the third year, I started working at the ABC as a radio producer on a casual basis. So I was just lucky, sort of snapped a job there, and then went and worked in regional radio and for the Country Hour, the rural department, for many years. I presented the Country Hour, various national programs, and then worked my way into radio current affairs. I worked on Alan Kohler's business program for a while. I worked for TV News, 7:30, Late Line. The thing about being a correspondent is that in part it's to do with it being incredibly multi-skilled. So a lot of it's ticking boxes about being able to do radio, TV, digital news, current affairs, live coverage, all those sorts of things. So after a while, I got my job my first posting in Johannesburg in 2004, and then went to Bangkok, came back briefly, went to Bangkok, Cambodia, then Thailand, came back briefly and then went to the US. In terms of preparation, well, as I said, I kind of ticked all those boxes myself because I felt that that was the path. But they do, it's one of the trainings that they do offer, that offer a lot of technical training because you have to be quite independent and good at problem solving and things like that, but also safety training. So we do a lot of training around working in conflict, working in the sorts of civil unrest that we're seeing in the States now, natural disasters, and those sorts of things. I mean, it so happens I've done a lot of that. I think I've done 6 or 7 cyclone, hurricane, typhoons, earthquakes, mass shootings, protests, elections. Yeah.
Well, that actually leads, I mean, there was a question that ties right into that is, what techniques or approaches do you use when talking to, well, protesters in these high stress and emotional situations? And, you know, how can you draw out insights from them in that sort of environment?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's 2 aspects to that. One is it's quite difficult to do nuanced interviews in that sort of environment when you're kind of looking over your shoulder, wondering if you're going to get hit in the head with a bottle or something like that. So there are some pretty sort of important things around where you do the interview and the risk that might be involved. So we tend to try to work on the flanks of protests so that we've got escape routes, because as you saw in some of that vision today, if you're right in front of the police and they start trying to push people through a chute or a narrow space, then you can very easily get caught up, knocked over, trodden on, whacked with something. And then today you saw police actually physically attack an Australian cameraman, a friend of mine, and the reporter. So the first thing would be to try to take the person a little bit away from the action, so that you can have a simple conversation with them. And then in that kind of scene, I mean, I think the most basic, most important thing is to just listen to people, to ask really open questions and to listen, but then also to press around, why are you doing this? How do you think this will fix things? What's your response to, you know, the argument that this is not the right approach? And just try to give really open questions so that you get actual open answers rather than it being a sort of gotcha exercise. Okay.
Could you comment on the changing role of social media as a factor in US politics, and while you were there, and even did it impact on your role as foreign correspondent?
Yeah, I think social media is still really evolving quite quickly. When I was in Bangkok, that was when Twitter first became a thing during the red shirt protests in 2010. And at that time, we were, as journalists, we were using Twitter a lot to actually figure out what was going on where on the ground in Bangkok, where there were sort of hotspots, but also where it was safe to be, where it wasn't safe to be, sort of as an information gathering tool. And it's also a way of sort of following credible people who have good information and then being able to curate that information and either share it or utilize it within your own sort of knowledge bank. Since then, I feel that Twitter's become sort of less important, and Facebook's become incredibly important as a news sharing vehicle, and that's also made it difficult to control fake news and manipulation of news because it's so easy to share on that kind of platform. But you've also got other things that are popping up that appeal to people of different demographics, especially younger people. So TikTok, for example, or Snapchat. It makes it difficult to grapple with as a journalist when you've got all these different platforms and how your content actually fits into those platforms or how to connect with people on those platforms. And I do think that, you know, news organisations generally, including the ABC, have really deliberately gone down the track of getting young digital natives so that we can understand how to utilise those platforms. But I also, I mean, I use social media vigorously as an information source, but also as a contact gathering source, a way of getting in touch with people, and also a way of sort of crowdsourcing information. Since I've been back in Australia, I've been doing a lot of stories about how people are affected by coronavirus, particularly at a personal level, and putting calls out on Facebook and Twitter can elicit some very genuine responses from people who you would otherwise not come across in life, who are happy to tell a story about their experience.
There was a question of how the transition from coming out of the US back to Australia had gone.
Look, coming back from a posting is more difficult than going, according to me. This is the third time I've done it. So, you know, to me, it's about a 2-year process of trying to resettle. I think for every expat who comes back to Australia, there's reverse culture shock. But I think that coming back from a foreign posting is kind of more like, well, added to the reverse culture shock, you have the sort of like either being a soldier or an elite athlete who is really sort of on the front end of watching world events unfold, and then all of a sudden you're back home in Melbourne and you're not on the front end of that anymore. And it's a huge transition, and it's difficult to find a path through that. I mean, it's hard for me to sit here in Australia watching what's unfolding in DC. In part, my mind says, oh, it's quite a relief not to be having to cover that because that's highly stressful. But the other part of me says, I feel like I have a responsibility to be telling those stories and to be really exposing what the actual issues are, and, you know, helping people understand that and giving people a voice. So yeah, it's a complex thing to navigate coming home.
Absolutely. When you were there, in terms of getting your job done, how much help was the Australian embassy? Is that a way of getting doors opened? Did you have a lot of contact with them, or not so much?
Yeah, so Kim Beazley was just leaving when I arrived. So he and I literally had a meeting and then he was gone. And so Joe Hockey was there throughout, and we have a good relationship. Also, I personally know many of the embassy staff because we tend to move in the same circles. In fact, there are staff at the embassy that I had known from my time in Southeast Asia who are now in DC. So, you know, there tends to be some synergy there. In terms of our day-to-day work, they don't really, it's not like a day-to-day thing, but obviously when the Prime Minister comes over, or if Australian politicians are in town, then, you know, we spend time together because we're with them while we're following the Prime Minister around or whatever. So I actually think, I mean, in terms of all the countries that I've worked, there is more closeness between the Bureau and the embassy in the US than elsewhere. And that might be in part just because there is so much news coming out of the US and very deep political ties between the two countries, and economic.
Just coming back onto a bit more geopolitical, I suppose. We'd asked about how the US views the rest of the world, but how much awareness is there of the relationship with China in particular amongst people in the US?
Not enough. I think, look, again, there is a portion of the community in the sort of foreign policy areas and those sorts of areas and politics who are incredibly engaged with that and very interested. But the rank and file Americans, I don't think so. I certainly think China has become more prominent because of Trump. And many people in business, farmers and the like, much as there's been concerns about his trade war, are quite supportive of his approach because they've felt that China was too powerful and that China needed to be pulled back in an economic context. But But other than that, I would say that China is much less prominent in America than it is in Australia, just because of the obvious geography. And also America is such a big country, and, you know, it is a great country, and many Americans think it's the best country in the world, so they view everything through that prism.
Again, do you think there's much awareness of the move away from some of the global international institutions that they were so much part of building? And I mean, World Health Organization, for example, is that getting much airplay there?
Yeah, well, only in the broadsheets. So New York Times, the Post, those sorts of newspapers. And again, that cohort that I mentioned before that has a sense of embarrassment, or what on earth are we doing around what's been happening politically over the last few years, is the same cohort that would be thinking, well, why are we exerting pressure on NATO? Why are we, you know, backing out of the WHO? Why are we backing out of the Paris Agreement? And all those sorts of things. So, you know, though those people recognise that you have to be a leader in the world, that you have to be involved in those organisations, and they worry about that.
I'm trying not to jump around too much, but Trump recently signed his executive order targeting social media companies' ability to manage their content and flagging posts. What do you think? Is that going to have an impact, or are they going to continue?
Well, I don't know. Twitter, you know, they seem to have finally decided to pick a fight with Trump. It's interesting timing, because, you know, he's been using that platform very combatively for years. So the fact that they've sort of finally decided to call him out is interesting 6 months before an election. I presume they did it because of coronavirus and, you know, misinformation and actual concern around people's health being affected by misinformation. And it's now sort of feeding into this civil unrest, racial situation. So will it make any difference? I don't know. It feels like sort of classic Trump red rag sort of approach. I wouldn't be surprised, like if there was going to be legal action to see if the executive order was enforceable, I wouldn't be surprised if they would take that sort of just for the fun of it. I mean, they've done it with several other executive orders that he's put out, even if it can't be enforced. But I can't see them actually really attempting to enforce it. The thing that I found most interesting about it really was that, you know, Donald Trump has been the architect of the whole fake news mantra, yet he is not prepared to be called out for fake news himself if what he's saying isn't accurate. So it kind of felt like we'd come full circle on that whole thing. And to me, I mean, as a journalist, obviously I'm very deeply concerned about misinformation and the fact that unfortunately we're kind of in an environment now that if you say something often enough, it becomes true, because most people don't have the motivation or perhaps the resources to go and figure out whether what they're reading or consuming is true. So it's very easy to influence people and send them down a path that's false.
I mean, it's obviously hard to look ahead to November and the election, but if Trump didn't win, do you think there's a risk that they will refuse to accept the result, or even, as someone suggested, try and find a way of postponing the election to a later date?
Yeah, well, I mean, all the scholars say that there's no actual functional way to postpone the election. And I feel that if they tried to do that, then that's probably going to escalate the general division even more than it is now. If he didn't win the election, would they not accept the result? Well, look, there was many people that I spoke to during the early discussions around impeachment did reference the idea of civil war if the Democrats tried to get him out of office that way. So I think there is a minority in the community that would be prepared to sort of take up arms. But, you know, at the end of the day, I do think that much as what we're seeing now is pretty frightening, America is a democratic country and people understand that they vote in their leaders. I mean, that's the system. They're very proud of their system. So my hope would be that by the time we get to November, it's safe enough with this virus that people can actually go out and vote, because I think possibly that's the bigger issue, that the structural issues around actually holding an election are quite complicated. Because there's so little trust in the idea of electronic or postal voting.
I was wondering, how much time did you spend actually in Washington focused on, I don't know, Beltway issues or politics versus getting out? You did a really interesting story up in Alaska one time. So roughly what was the percentage and how did you split your time?
Well, I would say I was pretty much out of DC for all of 2016. You know, coming in and out, but out every week, sometimes for a couple of weeks at a time. 2017 became more of a DC story because of everything that Trump was doing at the White House. So it became more of a White House-based posting. But 2018 and 19, probably out 60% of the time, perhaps. It's very hard to predict, but, you know, it's kind of 24/7 Donald Trump, but then also having to add to that several hurricanes, mass shootings, and all the other things that happen in America on any given day, which can be a lot.
We're starting to come to the end of our allotted time. We're just trying to get a couple more in. Do you think, will the current unrest in the US help Trump run a law and order campaign? And
yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
I think it's very possible that what's happening right now will advantage him politically. It's a little hard to see a way through that today, but I think that will start shaping up in the next couple of weeks. And the thing is that what he said today about sending in the military, which, you know, there were sort of cries of collective horror from around the world. A lot of people in America will be right behind that, getting things back under control, using power, and particularly the basically 35% of the population, which is his base, and they're essentially immovable as far as I'm concerned.
Okay. Well, maybe we can come to one more. There are a host of questions and we could keep going for a long time, but probably a hard one to pick. But did you have a favorite story you covered?
Look, there's many. The story we did in Alaska on the Trump administration's plans to drill for oil in a pristine wilderness up there was an incredible life adventure, the kind of thing that you'd very rarely get to do. So to be able to do that for work and see polar bears and fly through those mountains and all those sorts of things was an incredible experience. But I just value actually having been there to experience that election campaign in 2016, to be on the road, to talk to all those people, to really try to understand why they were voting the way they were, to be in a room with Donald Trump many times, to see Hillary Clinton accept the nomination, to be in the Oval Office many times and to be right on the front end of everything that was going on there in 2016 and 2017. It was very challenging as a journalist because, Donald Trump divides people, but just an endlessly fascinating thing to be able to experience and then to have the responsibility of trying to break that down and explain it.
Okay, well that's a fantastic wrap up to a really interesting hour. So Zoe, thank you very much for taking the time. We'd love to get you back when we're allowed to do meetings in person back at Dyson House. We will certainly invite you back and hear more as time goes on. But wish you all the best in your current work. Thank you very much for doing a great job there and here. And to everyone watching from home, thank you very much for your interest. Please stay safe, and we'll see you at the next webinar. So from us, you should do your sign off, Zoe, but
thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much.